A factory worker vanished without a trace during his shift in 2005, leaving his family desperate for answers. But 7 years later, something is found in a vent, and what they discover makes everyone's blood run cold. The alarm clock's shrill beep punctured the darkness at precisely 5:15. Jim Mercer's hand reached out, finding the button with practiced precision before his eyes even opened. Beside him, Sarah stirred slightly but didn't wake. 23 years of marriage had accustomed her to his early routine. Jim swung his feet to the floor, stretching his back as he stood. At 47, he felt the stiffness of age creeping into his joints, especially on cold November mornings like this one. The wooden floors creaked beneath his weight as he made his way to the bathroom, guided by muscle memory through the familiar darkness of their bedroom. 15 minutes later, freshly showered and dressed in his blue maintenance uniform, Jim descended the stairs of the modest two-story home on Maple Street. The kitchen awaited him, as it did every weekday morning. Coffee maker pre-programmed to start at 5:20, cereal box and bowl arranged on the countertop, local news playing softly on the small television in the corner. "Looks like we're in for some real winter weather today, folks," the meteorologist announced cheerfully. Temperatures dropping into the 20s by afternoon, with the first significant snowfall possibly arriving by tomorrow morning. Jim poured his coffee, adding a precise splash of cream, never too much, never too little. Through the kitchen window, he could see the darkness of the November morning, the streetlights still illuminating the quiet neighborhood. His Ford F-150, a reliable companion for nearly a decade, sat in the driveway, covered in a thin layer of frost that sparkled under the yellow glow of the street lamp. At 6:15, Sarah appeared in the kitchen doorway, wrapped in her faded blue robe, her hair tousled from sleep. "You're going to freeze in that jacket," she said, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "They're saying it might snow." Jim smiled, the crow's feet around his eyes deepening. "Been saying that for 3 days now. I'll believe it when I see it." Upstairs, floorboards creaked as Kyle, their 18-year-old son, began his morning routine. Wrestling practice before school meant early mornings for him too. Amanda, their 16-year-old daughter, would sleep for another hour before her own day began. "Kyle has a match tomorrow," Sarah reminded him, sitting across the small kitchen table. "Think you can get off early?" "Wouldn't miss it," Jim replied, folding the newspaper he'd been skimming. "Already cleared it with Kevin. I'll be there by 4:30. The sound of the shower running upstairs meant Kyle was fully awake now. Jim glanced at the clock. 6:30. Time to start moving. He rinsed his coffee mug, placing it in the sink before grabbing his lunch from the refrigerator, a sandwich and apple prepared by Sarah the night before. Kyle appeared in the kitchen, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, dark hair still damp from the shower. At 18, he was already taller than Jim, a fact that both surprised and delighted his father. "Morning, Dad," he mumbled, heading straight for the refrigerator. "Big day today?" Jim asked, watching his son pour a glass of orange juice. "Coach says the guy from Ohio State might come watch practice," Kyle replied, attempting to sound casual despite the obvious excitement in his voice. Jim clapped him on the shoulder. "They'd be lucky to have you, son." Before leaving, Jim climbed the stairs one more time, gently pushing open Amanda's door. In the dim light from the hallway, he could see her sleeping form, dark hair spread across the pillow. She stirred slightly as he leaned down to kiss her forehead. "See you tonight, Pumpkin," he whispered. "Love you." Back downstairs, he kissed Sarah goodbye, a quick but tender moment they'd shared every morning for over 2 decades. "Drive safe," she said, the same words she always offered as he headed out the door. "Love you." "Love you more," he replied with a smile, their daily ritual complete. The morning air bit at his face as Jim stepped outside, his breath visible in small clouds. He scraped the frost from his windshield with practiced efficiency, the familiar sound of ice crackling beneath the plastic scraper, breaking the pre-dawn silence of Maple Street. The drive to Chemtech took exactly 22 minutes, the same route he'd driven for 20 years. Jim pulled into the employee parking lot at 6:40, guiding his truck into the same spot he always claimed, 3rd row from the entrance, 4 spaces from the left. The ritual provided a comfort that defined Jim's life: predictable, reliable, secure. "Morning, Jim," called the security guard at the entrance, a heavy-set man named George who'd been checking IDs at Chemtech for as long as Jim could remember. "Morning, George. Cold enough for you?" Jim replied, scanning his badge at the entrance. "They're saying snow by tomorrow," George answered, stamping his feet against the cold. "So I hear," Jim said with a smile, continuing through the metal detector and into the warmth of the building. The factory hummed with early morning activity, shift workers ending their night rotations, day workers just beginning. Jim made his way to the time clock, punching in at exactly 6:43. From there, he headed to the break room for a second cup of coffee, this one from the Dunkin' Donuts across the street, a small Thursday tradition he allowed himself. Kevin Walsh, his supervisor for the past 7 years, was reviewing maintenance logs when Jim approached, coffee in one hand, metal toolbox in the other. "Morning, Kev," Jim said, peering over the supervisor's shoulder. "Everything running smooth?" Kevin turned, his perpetually worried expression softening slightly at the sight of Jim. "Mostly. Got some strange readings from the East Wing boiler yesterday afternoon. Pressure fluctuations, nothing major, but worth checking out." Jim nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "I heard something odd down there yesterday, sort of a knocking sound. Was going to check it out anyway." "You're a step ahead as usual, Jim," Kevin said with an appreciative nod. "Let me know what you find." Jim headed toward the stairwell that led to the basement of the East Wing, toolbox in hand. "Volto emumahora, Kev," he called over his shoulder, the facility's fluorescent lights reflecting off his thinning hair as he disappeared through the heavy metal door. While the Mercer family settled into their morning routines and Jim's colleagues continued their work at Chemtech, no one could have known that at precisely 7:15, Detective Frank Burnett's phone would ring with a call about security footage at a chemical plant, footage with an inexplicable 32-minute gap that coincided exactly with when Jim Mercer was last seen entering the basement of the East Wing. Detective Frank Burnett stood in the darkened security room of Chemtech, his weathered face illuminated by the blue glow of multiple monitors. At 53, with 27 years on the force, he'd seen his share of missing persons cases, but something about Jim Mercer's disappearance nagged at him in a way he couldn't ignore. He rewound the security footage again, watching as Jim entered the building, exchanged pleasantries with George at the entrance, punched his time card, and then vanished into the stairwell leading to the East Wing basement at exactly 7:03. Then, nothing. The screen flickered with static before resuming at 7:35, showing empty corridors and workers going about their business, but no Jim Mercer. "Explain this gap to me again," Burnett said, turning to Ronald Peters, the head of security, a thin man with nervous eyes who kept adjusting his tie. "Like I said, Detective, it happens sometimes. System overload, power fluctuation, could be anything. Our security setup isn't exactly state-of-the-art." Peters shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "We've been asking for upgrades for years." Burnett studied the man's face, noting the slight sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the room. "Convenient timing for a malfunction, wouldn't you say?" Outside the building, a specialized K9 unit had arrived, 2 German shepherds and their handlers preparing to track Jim's scent. The lead officer gathered the search team in the parking lot, his breath visible in the November morning air. "Listen up, everyone. We need to maintain scent integrity. That means nobody goes into the search areas unless absolutely necessary. These dogs need Jim Mercer's scent, not yours." The dogs, eager and focused, were given one of Jim's shirts from home to establish the scent. They led the officers directly to the entrance, through the same path Jim had taken the previous day, down to the basement stairs, and into the boiler room. The animals moved with purpose until reaching a heavy metal door leading to a maintenance corridor, where they circled, whined, and lost the trail. "What's behind this door?" Burnett asked a facility manager who had accompanied them. "Maintenance corridor. Mostly ductwork, pipes, electrical conduits. It runs behind several rooms, including some restricted areas." "Restricted how?" "Chemical storage, proprietary equipment, standard industrial security. Back at the Mercer home, Sarah sat on the edge of Amanda's bed, holding her daughter's trembling hands. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, creating pools of light on the carpet that seemed out of place, given the darkness of their conversation. "So nobody knows where Dad is?" Amanda asked, her voice small, childlike despite her 16 years. "How can someone just disappear from their job?" Sarah pulled her daughter close, stroking her hair. "The police are looking for him right now. They have dogs that can follow his scent, and they're checking all the security cameras." She tried to keep her voice steady, to project a confidence she didn't feel. "Your father wouldn't just leave us, Amanda. Something happened, and we're going to find out what." In the kitchen, Kyle was manning the phone, taking names and numbers of neighbors offering to help. Mrs. Peterson from across the street organized a meal train. Mrs. Landry, 2 doors down, volunteered to coordinate search parties in the area surrounding the plant. And Mr. Collins, Jim's bowling teammate, promised to reach out to their mutual friends. The Mercer's kitchen counter was already filling with casserole dishes and baked goods, the community's instinctive response to tragedy. At Chemtech, Burnett had commandeered a small conference room for interviews. Kevin Walsh sat across from him, his normally worried expression now etched with genuine concern. Jim mentioned checking on a noise in the boiler room, but there was no scheduled maintenance for that area, Kevin explained, rubbing his temples. "That's what makes this so strange. Jim was meticulous about following protocols. If there was an issue, he would have documented it and probably called for backup." Burnett made a note in his pad. "And you're sure he was alone?" "As far as I know, Thursday mornings are quiet around here. Most maintenance is scheduled for weekends when production slows." Something caught Burnett's eye as he flipped through facility documents. A notation showing the boiler room area had been marked as restricted access for 24 hours prior to Jim's disappearance. "What's this about?" he asked, showing the document to Kevin. The supervisor frowned. "I don't know. That restriction wasn't in my schedule. Must have come from higher up." By afternoon, the Mercer home had become a hub of activity. Sarah moved through the living room like a ghost, answering endless phone calls from friends, family, and church members offering support. Pastor Williams from First Baptist sat quietly in an armchair, offering prayers and reassurance whenever Sarah seemed to falter. "God sees Jim, even if we don't know where he is," the pastor said gently, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder. In the driveway, Kyle intercepted Burnett as the detective returned from the plant. The young man's resemblance to his father was striking. Same steady gaze, same set of the jaw. "I want to help," Kyle said without preamble. "I know all Dad's stories about that plant, the places he liked to take breaks, the shortcuts he used. Maybe there's something I would recognize that others wouldn't." Burnett regarded the young man thoughtfully. "We'll keep that in mind, Kyle. Right now, the best thing you can do is be here for your mom and sister." Later that evening, Burnett met with his team at the station, spreading photos and timelines across a conference table. "We have 73 employees to interview and a 32-minute gap with no documentation. Let's focus on anyone who might have had access to the security system or the East Wing during that time frame." Meanwhile, Amanda sat cross-legged on her bed, paging through family photo albums. She paused at a recent picture. Her father teaching her to fish at a local reservoir, his patient hands showing her how to tie a lure. A tear splashed onto the plastic sleeve protecting the photo. That night, when the house had finally quieted, Sarah slipped into Jim's side of the bed, burying her face in his pillow, inhaling his fading scent. In the darkness, she allowed the tears she'd been holding back all day to flow freely, her body shaking with silent sobs. Just after midnight, Burnett's personal cell phone rang, displaying an unknown number. He answered cautiously. "Detective Burnett." A distorted voice responded, "If you want to find Jim Mercer, ask about what happens in the East Wing when night shifts end and why 3 employees suddenly quit last month." Burnett clutched his phone, pulse quickening as the distorted voice fell silent. He considered demanding the caller's identity but thought better of it. Anonymous tips required delicate handling. Instead, he simply asked, "Why are you telling me this?" The line went dead. Early the next morning, rain tapped against the windshield of Burnett's sedan as he reviewed his notes. 3 names were circled on his notepad: Michael Grayson, Thomas Webb, and Edward Collins, the employees who had abruptly quit Chemtech in the weeks before Jim disappeared. Grayson had relocated to a small town in Michigan, Webb to Phoenix, Arizona. Only Collins remained in Akron. Burnett parked outside a modest bungalow in the western suburbs. The lawn needed mowing, and newspapers had accumulated on the porch, signs of neglect or absence. He approached the door and knocked firmly. After a long moment, the door opened a crack, revealing a disheveled man in his 50s with bloodshot eyes and several days' stubble. Edward Collins? Burnett held up his badge. Detective Frank Burnett, Akron PD. I'd like to ask you a few questions about Chemtech. Collins attempted to close the door. I don't have anything to say about that place. Burnett wedged his foot in the doorway. Sir, I'm investigating the disappearance of Jim Mercer. Anything you know could help a family in crisis. Collins's expression shifted from annoyance to something resembling fear. After a moment's hesitation, he stepped onto the porch, pulling the door nearly closed behind him, as if afraid someone inside might overhear. I can't talk about it, he said in a low voice. I signed papers when I left. They'll sue me into oblivion. What happens in the East Wing after hours? Burnett pressed, recalling the anonymous tip. Collins's eyes widened slightly. Who told you about that? You did just now, Burnett replied evenly. What's going on there, Mr. Collins? The former employee glanced nervously at neighboring houses before responding. There are operations that happen off the books, after regular shifts when most people are gone, in the East Wing. He swallowed hard. I don't know details. I just know it's not normal procedure, not documented in the regular logs. And Jim Mercer? Collins shook his head firmly. I know nothing about what happened to him. That's God's honest truth. His hands trembled slightly. But I got out while I could. That's all I'm saying. Back at the station, Burnett spread facility access records across his desk. He'd requested logs showing after-hours entries for the past 6 months. A pattern emerged: executive-level badges accessing the facility during odd hours, particularly between midnight and 4 in the morning, approximately every 2 weeks. 3 names appeared consistently: Robert Daniels, Vice President of Operations; Howard Mitchell, Environmental Compliance Director; and Carlos Ramirez, Regional Manager. None had mentioned these visits during initial interviews. Across town, Sarah sat at Jim's desk in their home office, methodically searching through his papers. The familiar scent of his aftershave lingered in the small room, bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. In the bottom drawer, beneath tax documents and insurance policies, she discovered a folder labeled Maintenance Concerns. Inside were handwritten notes about equipment issues, along with more troubling observations. 3rd unreported leak this month, and disposal protocols bypassed again. Need to document. Sarah's hands trembled as she read. Jim had never mentioned these concerns to her, but it was clear he'd been troubled by something at work. At Chemtech, the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. When Burnett arrived that afternoon, a security guard stopped him at the entrance. I'm sorry, Detective. New policy as of this morning. We need advance notice and proper authorization for any non-employee access. Behind the guard stood a tall, silver-haired man in an expensive suit who approached with practiced confidence. Detective Burnett, Bernard Wilson, Chief Legal Officer for Chemtech's parent company. He extended a manicured hand. I understand you've been conducting interviews on our premises. I'm investigating a missing person, Burnett replied, ignoring the offered handshake. Wilson nodded sympathetically. Of course, a tragic situation. However, we have proprietary processes and materials that require protection. I'm sure you understand. Moving forward, we'll need formal requests for any access, including warrants where appropriate. That evening, Kyle sat in a dimly lit corner booth at O'Malley's, a bar where his father's co-workers often gathered after shifts. Across from him sat Michael, a maintenance worker who had trained under Jim. Your dad was worried about something, Michael said quietly, nursing his beer. Last few weeks before he, said he'd found something he wasn't supposed to see, paperwork or something. He glanced around nervously. Look, I liked your dad. Everybody did. But I got a family too, you know? At Firestone High School, Amanda walked with her head down, acutely aware of the whispers and stares following her through the hallway. Her friend Jessica fell into step beside her. Ignore them, Jessica said firmly. They're just curious. Your dad will turn up. Amanda nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. In a downtown courthouse, Judge Harris reviewed Burnett's request for expanded warrants. You're asking for quite a lot here, Detective. Environmental logs, security records, personnel files. We're looking for anything that might explain Jim Mercer's disappearance, Burnett explained. The more we investigate, the more it appears there may be activities at Chemtech that aren't part of regular operations. When Sarah sorted through Jim's desk that evening, a small card fell from between folders, a business card for the Environmental Protection Agency with a handwritten note. Call Monday. She stared at it, wondering what Jim had planned to report. Later that night, Kyle shared his discoveries with Sarah and Burnett at the kitchen table. Dad was checking something with the waste disposal system, he explained. Michael said he'd been documenting issues for weeks. Sarah looked toward their bedroom, where Jim's clean work uniform still hung in the closet. The reality that he might never wear it again struck her with fresh pain. As Burnett left the Mercer home, his phone rang. It was his contact at the phone company with information he'd requested on Jim's cell records. Found something unusual, Detective. On the morning he disappeared, at 6:58, Mercer made a 3-minute call to a number registered to Howard Mitchell, Environmental Compliance Director at Chemtech, the same Howard Mitchell who told you repeatedly that he barely knew Jim Mercer. Burnett gripped his phone tightly, the pieces finally connecting in his mind. Howard Mitchell had lied, not just omitted information, but deliberately lied about his relationship with Jim Mercer. The detective thanked his contact at the phone company and immediately made notes for tomorrow's confrontation. The following morning, Burnett strode through Chemtech's main entrance, flashing his badge with such authority that the security guard didn't attempt to stop him. He made his way directly to the executive wing, where polished wooden doors replaced the utilitarian metal ones found throughout the rest of the facility. Without knocking, he entered Howard Mitchell's office. Mitchell looked up from his computer, surprise quickly masked by practiced corporate composure. Detective Burnett, I wasn't aware we had an appointment. We don't, Burnett replied, closing the door behind him. Let's talk about your phone call with Jim Mercer at 6:58 on the morning he disappeared. A flicker of unease crossed Mitchell's face before his expression settled into careful neutrality. I received dozens of calls from maintenance personnel about compliance issues. It's part of my job. Funny because you told me repeatedly that you barely knew Jim Mercer, yet phone records show he called you directly, not through any work order system, minutes before he vanished. Mitchell straightened his silk tie. I may have misspoken. By barely knew, I meant our interactions were purely professional. He called about a routine maintenance concern near the boiler room. Nothing unusual. And what exactly was this routine concern? Pressure readings, if I recall correctly. Standard procedure when dealing with our chemical processes. Burnett studied the executive's immaculate appearance, the tailored suit, the manicured nails, the carefully controlled expression. Everything about Howard Mitchell was calculated, including his lies. Across town, Sarah Mercer sat at her kitchen table with Kelly Adams, a former secretary from Chemtech who had left the company 3 years earlier. Jim was the kind who followed every rule, Kelly said, warming her hands around a coffee mug. If something wasn't right, he'd document it, report it through proper channels. He wasn't a troublemaker, but he was thorough. Sarah nodded. That sounds like Jim. Did he ever mention problems with waste disposal or environmental concerns? Not specifically to me, but there were always rumors about the East Wing operations. The secretarial pool wasn't privy to those details. Later that afternoon, Kyle sat across from his academic advisor at Akron Community College. the acceptance letter he'd received months ago sitting between them. "I'm sorry, but I need to defer my enrollment," Kyle explained, his voice steady despite the disappointment evident in his eyes. "With my dad missing, my family needs financial support. I can't commit to full-time studies right now." The advisor nodded sympathetically. "Your admission will remain valid for 2 years, Kyle. When things stabilize, you can pick up where you left off." As Kyle left the building, he felt a strange mix of sadness and resolve. His father had worked so hard to ensure Kyle could attend college, the first in their family to do so. Now that dream would have to wait. At Firestone High School, Amanda rushed into a bathroom stall, tears streaming down her face after overhearing a conversation in the hallway. "I heard her dad just took off," one girl had whispered loudly enough for Amanda to hear. "My mom says men do that sometimes, midlife crisis or whatever, or maybe he killed himself." The cruel speculation had hit Amanda like a physical blow. She knew her father would never abandon them, but as days passed with no answers, the whispers grew louder, both in school hallways and in her own mind during sleepless nights. By the weekend, the local community had organized search parties to comb through wooded areas surrounding the Chemtech facility. Volunteers in reflective vests formed orderly lines, calling Jim's name as they methodically covered ground that had already been searched by police and dogs, but they felt compelled to try anyway. Sarah stood in her kitchen each morning, marking another day on the calendar, a ritual that measured both hope and despair. 7 red marks now formed a stark line across the previously ordinary grid of dates. On the 8th day after Jim's disappearance, Burnett received a formal notification from Chemtech's legal team, challenging his search warrants as overly broad and potentially compromising to proprietary industrial processes. The legal maneuver would delay his access to critical records by days, possibly weeks. That same afternoon, Kyle walked into Malone's auto repair, his father's toolbox in hand. "I can start immediately," he told the owner, Mike Malone, who had known Jim for years. "Dad taught me basic mechanics since I was 14. I'm a quick learner for the rest." Mike nodded, recognizing the determination in the young man's eyes. "We could use the help. When can you start?" "Tomorrow morning," Kyle replied without hesitation. At Chemtech, Richard Hoffman was clearing personal items from his desk when Burnett arrived for a follow-up interview. "You're leaving?" Burnett asked, surveying the half-empty office. Hoffman nodded, avoiding eye contact. "Transfer to Pittsburgh. They need someone with my experience to oversee operations there." "Convenient timing." "It's been in the works for months," Hoffman insisted, though his nervous movements suggested otherwise. "Has nothing to do with Jim Mercer." Each night Sarah had begun a new ritual, lighting a candle on the front porch, placing it where it could be seen from the street, a beacon to guide Jim home, should he be out there somewhere, trying to find his way back to them. Across town, in a quiet coffee shop away from curious eyes, Michael Chen from the Akron Beacon Journal interviewed former Chemtech employees, collecting information for what was becoming more than just a missing person story. The tension in the Mercer home grew palpable as the investigation stalled. During a particularly difficult evening meeting with Burnett, Kyle slammed his fist on the table. "They're hiding something. It's obvious. Why can't you make them talk?" "We need evidence, not just suspicions," Burnett explained, understanding the young man's frustration. Later that night, Kyle punched the garage wall in a moment of raw anger, the physical pain providing momentary relief from the emotional torment. Amanda found him sitting on the concrete floor, cradling his bruised hand. Without a word, she sat beside him, their shoulders touching in silent solidarity. While sorting through old photos that weekend, seeking comfort in memories, Sarah noticed something in a fishing trip picture from last summer. A partially visible document protruding from Jim's shirt pocket, bearing the distinctive EPA logo. She stared at it, wondering what connection it might have to his disappearance. Exactly 1 month after Jim vanished, as media interest waned and the case grew colder, Sarah's phone rang at midnight. She answered immediately, hope flaring despite the late hour. "Hello?" A digitally altered voice responded, "If you want to know what happened to your husband, Investigate what Chemtech dumps into the Cuyahoga River on alternate Tuesdays and why 3 executives were at the plant the morning Jim disappeared. Sarah jolted awake, the anonymous caller's words echoing in her mind. She fumbled for the notepad she now kept beside her bed, hands trembling as she scribbled down the cryptic message, Chemtech dumps, Cuyahoga River, alternate Tuesdays, 3 executives. At 6 in the morning, unable to wait any longer, she dialed Burnett's number. Terças feiras alternadas, she said the moment he answered, not bothering with greetings. We need to check this out. Someone called last night. They mentioned the river and 3 executives being there when Jim disappeared. Burnett sat upright in bed, instantly alert. I'll look into it right away. Don't tell anyone else about this call, Sarah. Within the hour, Burnett was at his desk at the police station, surrounded by case files that had steadily accumulated over the past month. He opened his laptop and began researching Chemtech's environmental record, navigating through public databases maintained by the EPA and state authorities. The screen displayed a pattern that raised his suspicions: multiple minor violations over the past 5 years, all resolved with minimal fines and no significant consequences. None individually serious enough to trigger major investigations, but collectively forming a troubling pattern of disregard for environmental regulations. Slaps on the wrist, Burnett muttered to himself, printing out the documents. They treat fines as a cost of doing business. That evening, dressed in jeans and a dark jacket, Burnett parked his unmarked car a quarter-mile from Chemtech. He followed a muddy trail that ran parallel to the facility's perimeter fence, making his way toward the Cuyahoga River. The moon occasionally emerged from behind clouds, providing just enough light to navigate the rough path. After 20 minutes of careful movement, he reached a point where a large drainage pipe extended from the direction of the factory to the river. Even in the dim light, he could see that the water surrounding the pipe's outlet had an unusual oily sheen, and the distinctive chemical odor rising from it made him pull his shirt collar over his nose. Burnett removed sterile collection vials from his pocket and carefully gathered samples of the water, noting the strange coloration. He sealed each container meticulously, documenting the time and location of collection. Before leaving, he took photographs using a camera designed for low-light conditions. Back at the Mercer home, Kyle collapsed onto the living room sofa at 2 in the morning, still wearing his pizza delivery uniform. After working a full day at the auto shop and then delivering pizzas until closing time, exhaustion had overtaken him completely. Sarah emerged from her bedroom upon hearing him come in, quietly draping a blanket over her sleeping son, her heart aching at the dark circles under his eyes. The following morning, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with calculator in hand, sorting bills into piles. Urgent, can wait, and impossible. Without Jim's income, their financial situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Sarah's part-time salary from the dental office barely covered groceries and utilities. At Firestone High School, Amanda hunched over textbooks in the library during her lunch period. Despite the emotional turmoil of her father's disappearance, she remained determined to maintain her academic scholarship. Her concentration wavered frequently as thoughts of her father intruded, but she forced herself to refocus each time, knowing her education was something her dad had valued deeply. "Miss Mercer, the library is closing for lunch period," the librarian said gently. "Just 5 more minutes, please," Amanda replied without looking up. "I have a calculus test next period." At the police station, Burnett found himself summoned to Captain Reynolds' office, where his superior's expression telegraphed disapproval before he even spoke. "Frank, we have 3 new homicide cases that need immediate attention," Reynolds said, gesturing to files on his desk. "I need you to shift your focus." "Jim Mercer has been missing for over a month," Burnett countered. "We're making progress." "Progress? Your most promising lead is a midnight anonymous phone call and water samples from a river that borders dozens of industrial facilities." Reynolds sighed. "Look, I'm not saying abandon the case, but we need to prioritize." Later that afternoon, Sarah approached her boss at Parkside Dental with reluctance in her step, but determination in her voice. "Dr. Patterson, I was wondering if there might be any additional hours available," she asked carefully. "With Jim still missing, things are tight." The dentist's face softened with sympathy. "Of course, Sarah, we can certainly arrange something." At a downtown coffee shop, Michael Chen sat across from Sarah, recorder placed discreetly between them. "I want people to know Jim as a person," Chen explained, "not just as a police case. Tell me about him, what he loved, what he stood for." Sarah smiled softly, remembering. Jim believed in doing things right, even when no one was looking, especially when no one was looking. Back at home, Kyle sorted through the day's mail, quietly slipping a collection notice into his pocket before Sarah could see it. The strain of maintaining a brave face was becoming harder each day, but he remained determined to shield his mother from additional worries. 3 days later, Burnett received a thick envelope containing the analysis results from the water samples. As he read through the report, his expression hardened. Levels of industrial solvents, heavy metals, and chemical byproducts far exceeded legal limits. This wasn't just a violation, it was willful contamination on a criminal scale. That evening, Sarah performed her nightly ritual, lighting a candle on the front porch, a beacon of hope in the growing darkness. From across the street, neighbors watched with a mixture of sympathy and unspoken pity, wondering how long she would maintain the practice. On the following Tuesday night, exactly as the anonymous caller had suggested, Burnett parked his car on a service road with a clear view of Chemtech's rear entrance. Just after midnight, he observed 3 unmarked trucks entering through a rarely used gate, their headlights cutting through the darkness. He raised his camera, capturing images of the vehicles and their license plates. As he focused on the activity by the loading docks, a pair of headlights suddenly appeared behind him, approaching rapidly. Recognizing a Chemtech security vehicle, Burnett attempted to start his car and drive away discreetly, only to discover that all 4 of his tires had been slashed. The security car's high beams illuminated his vehicle completely, making it clear that his presence hadn't just been noticed, it had been anticipated. The security vehicle's high beams pinned Burnett like a specimen under glass, the slashed tires eliminating any chance of escape. Swallowing his frustration, he stepped out with badge in hand, squinting against the blinding light. "Akron Police," he announced firmly, as 2 security guards approached, hands hovering near their holsters. "I'm investigating reports of suspicious activity in this area." The taller guard, a hard-faced man with cropped gray hair, examined Burnett's identification with exaggerated care. "Awful coincidence you'd be investigating right outside our facility, Detective," he said, keying his radio. "Base, this is Tanner. Got an APD detective out here, claims he's working a case." After a moment of staticky conversation that Burnett couldn't quite make out, the guard's demeanor shifted subtly. "You picked an interesting location for your stakeout, Detective. Lots of woods around here, plenty of places to investigate." "I go where the evidence leads me," Burnett replied evenly, noting the guard's nameplate, J. Marshall, and committing it to memory. The guards eventually allowed him to call for a tow truck, maintaining their watchful presence until he was safely off Chemtech property. The message was unmistakable. The company knew exactly what he was doing and had resources to monitor his movements. 2 days later, Burnett sat across from Elaine Winters, a tired-looking EPA enforcement officer with prematurely gray hair and sharp eyes that suggested she missed nothing. "These levels are dangerously high," Burnett said, sliding the analysis results across her desk. "This isn't just a violation, it's criminal." Winters examined the report, her expression darkening. "I've seen this before with Chemtech. The problem is building a case that will stick." She looked up at Burnett. "We need multiple samples, meticulous documentation. Corporate environmental cases require overwhelming evidence, and even then, the legal battles can drag on for years." "A man is missing," Burnett reminded her. "And that might be what finally brings them down," she replied. "But we have to do this by the book, or they'll walk." 2 years had passed since Jim's disappearance. In the Mercer living room, Sarah surrounded herself with photos of Jim, carefully arranging them on poster boards for the upcoming vigil. The collection of images, Jim coaching Kyle's Little League team, teaching Amanda to ride a bike, holding Sarah on their 20th anniversary, told the story of a life interrupted. "We won't let him be forgotten," Sarah whispered to the empty room, securing a final photo to the board. That evening, dozens gathered outside the Chemtech facility, holding candles that flickered in the November wind. Local news crews captured the solemn scene as Sarah, Kyle, and Amanda stood at the front, holding an enlarged portrait of Jim, his warm smile a stark contrast to their grief-etched faces. The renewed media attention brought fresh momentum to the case. Michael Chen, who had continued investigating independently, published a detailed article connecting Jim's disappearance to Chemtech's environmental violations. Anonymous sources within the company describe undocumented night procedures and restricted areas with limited access, Chen wrote. Multiple former employees report concerns about waste disposal practices, though most refuse to speak on record, citing fear of retaliation. The article struck a nerve. The following morning, Chen discovered his car with slashed tires, an echo of what happened to Burnett, and a note on his windshield: "Stop digging, or you'll be the next to disappear." Chen reported the threat to Burnett, who added it to his growing file of evidence, suggesting Chemtech's desperation to bury the story. At Akron Community College, Kyle sat across from his academic counselor, formalizing his withdrawal from classes he'd never had the chance to attend. "Maybe in a few years," Kyle said, signing the paperwork. "Right now, my family needs me." The counselor nodded sympathetically. "Your admission will remain valid for 3 years, Kyle. When you're ready, we'll be here." Sarah had finally agreed to seek professional help, sitting uncomfortably in a therapist's office downtown. "Sometimes I wake up and for just a second, I forget he's not there," she admitted, twisting her wedding ring. "And then I remember all over again." At school, Amanda found herself in a heated confrontation with classmates who had been spreading cruel rumors about her father. "He didn't abandon us," she insisted, voice steady despite her tears. "My father would never do that. Something happened to him." Back at the police station, Burnett meticulously reviewed Chemtech entry logs obtained through a court order. He circled 3 names that appeared on the day of Jim's disappearance: Howard Mitchell, Robert Daniels, VP of Operations, and Carlos Ramirez, Regional Manager, all present during hours they had previously denied being at the facility. Financial pressure continued to mount for the Mercers. Sarah reluctantly sold family jewelry at a local pawn shop, receiving a fraction of its sentimental value. "Just these pieces," she told the clerk, carefully setting aside her wedding ring. "This stays with me." Late one night, Kyle returned home at 2 a.m. after his pizza delivery shift to find Sarah asleep in the living room chair, waiting up for him despite her early morning shift. The sight of her there, head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, a half-empty cup of cold tea beside her, crystallized the toll Jim's absence had taken on their family. The following evening, Burnett received another anonymous call. "What you're looking for is in the old ventilation system," the distorted voice said. "But be careful, detective. They don't want you to find it." The warning lingered in Burnett's mind as he drove home that night. He parked in his driveway, immediately noticing something wrong. His front door stood slightly ajar, the porch light casting an ominous shadow across the threshold. Drawing his weapon, he cautiously entered to discover his home office completely ransacked. All files related to the Mercer case were gone, including the water analysis results and his personal notes about the 3 Chemtech executives. Burnett stood in his ransacked office, shock giving way to a cold, calculated anger. This wasn't a random break-in. This was a deliberate attempt to derail his investigation. After calling it in, he gave the responding officers minimal details, describing it as a standard burglary, while deliberately omitting connections to the Mercer case. "Laptop, some cash, personal files," he told Officer Martinez vaguely. "Nothing irreplaceable." Once the officers left, Burnett drove to a 24-hour storage facility on the outskirts of town. He punched in his access code and slipped inside his small unit, where a waterproof container held backup hard drives and copies of key documents from the Mercer investigation, a precaution he'd taken months ago when the case started feeling increasingly dangerous. "Not as smart as you think you are," he muttered to the invisible opposition. The following day, Burnett met Sarah at a quiet diner 15 miles from Akron, far from any potential Chemtech surveillance. "They broke into your house?" Sarah whispered, her coffee untouched. "They're getting desperate, aren't they?" Burnett nodded, sliding a backup thumb drive across the table. "Keep this somewhere safe. It means we're getting close to something they don't want found." 5 years had passed since Jim's disappearance. The world had continued turning. The economy had crashed, presidents had changed, but for the Mercer family, time remained fractured into before and after. Kyle, now 23, had become the family's primary breadwinner, his youthful dreams of college buried beneath the immediate needs of survival. News of Chemtech's partial closure rippled through Akron like a stone dropped in still water. The recession had hit Ohio's manufacturing sector hard, and the chemical industry wasn't immune. "We're streamlining operations," Chemtech's press release stated blandly. "The East Wing facility will be decommissioned while we maintain core production capabilities." When Sarah heard the announcement on the evening news, a chill ran through her. The East Wing, where Jim had vanished, would soon be dismantled, potentially destroying whatever evidence remained hidden there. That same week, Kyle was tending bar at the Rusty Nail, a blue-collar establishment where many industrial workers unwound after shifts. A new face appeared at the bar, a stocky man in his 30s with calloused hands and observant eyes. "Ray Peterson," the man introduced himself, ordering a draft beer. "Just started at Chemtech last month, maintenance division." Kyle's hand hesitated briefly as he pulled the tap. "Maintenance, huh? My dad worked maintenance there." As the night progressed and the crowd thinned, Kyle found himself sharing more with Ray, the connection to his father's workplace, creating an instant bond. "Strange place," Ray commented, nursing his second beer. "Sections of the factory completely locked down, even though they're supposedly decommissioned. Nobody wants to talk about anything that happened before 2010. Kyle leaned closer. "My dad disappeared there. Jim Mercer. November 17, 2005. Recognition flickered in Ray's eyes. "I've heard whispers, never the full story." Across town, Sarah faced the moment she'd been dreading for years. Seated at her kitchen table with Amanda and Kyle, surrounded by past due notices, she finally said the words aloud. "We need to sell the house," she admitted, voice breaking. "I've tried everything, but we can't keep up with the payments anymore." Kyle slammed his fist on the table. "Dad never would have wanted us to live like this. He would want us to move forward." "Moving forward doesn't mean giving up on him," Sarah responded, tears welling in her eyes. "I promised Jim I'd be here when he came home." The process of packing their family home became a painful excavation of memories. Each object wrapped in newspaper, each photo removed from walls, felt like a small betrayal. Amanda stood in her childhood bedroom, carefully removing posters and photographs. "Remember when Dad painted this room purple because I was obsessed with that show about the singing detective?" she asked Kyle, who was helping disassemble her bed. "He hated that color," Kyle laughed softly. "Said it gave him a headache, but he never complained." In the garage, Sarah methodically packed Jim's tools, each wrench and screwdriver representing projects completed and others left eternally unfinished. She ran her fingers over the engraving on his favorite hammer. "To Jim, love Dad," before carefully wrapping it in cloth. The apartment they moved into felt temporary, despite their efforts to make it home. The walls were too thin, the ceilings too low, the space too confined for the ghost of Jim that moved with them. "Dad would understand," Amanda said one evening, watching Sarah arrange their family photos on a small end table. "He always said home is where we're together." In her new bedroom, Sarah placed her wedding photo on the nightstand, positioning it so Jim's face would be the first thing she saw each morning. At the Akron Beacon Journal, Michael Chen continued his investigation discreetly. meeting a source in a dimly lit parking garage. Chemtech has similar lawsuits in Michigan and Pennsylvania, the figure explained, keeping his face shadowed. Same pattern of environmental violations, same corporate response: deny, delay, discard evidence. 2 months from retirement, Burnett faced increasing pressure to close or transfer his ongoing cases. In his captain's office, he stood his ground. "I'm seeing this through," he insisted, with or without departmental support. At the Rusty Nail, Kyle showed Ray old photos of his father at the plant, including one where Jim stood proudly in his distinctive blue maintenance uniform. "He loved that job," Kyle said, "took pride in keeping everything running smoothly." On her anniversary, Sarah sat alone at a small table with a cupcake and single candle, a ritual she'd maintained for 5 years, marking the day she had become Mrs. James Mercer. At Chemtech, Ray Peterson inspected the decommissioned areas with careful attention, discreetly photographing restricted sections with his phone. He paused before a locked door marked East Wing, restricted access, his curiosity piqued by what might lie beyond. Exactly 7 years after Jim's disappearance, on November 17, 2012, Ray Peterson was conducting a routine inspection of the factory's ventilation systems when his flashlight beam illuminated something caught between the grates of an old fan, a torn piece of blue fabric identical to the maintenance uniforms worn by Chemtech employees in 2005. Ray's heart pounded as he carefully examined the blue fabric caught in the ventilation grate. Working on maintenance at Chemtech for only a few months, he'd heard whispers about Jim Mercer's disappearance, but seeing this physical evidence made the old story suddenly, chillingly real. His flashlight beam illuminated the fabric, unmistakably a piece of the standard-issue work uniform, the exact shade of blue that Kyle had shown him in those old photographs. Glancing over his shoulder to confirm he was alone, Ray pulled out his phone and snapped several clear photos from different angles. His hands trembled slightly as he carefully documented the location, making mental notes of exactly which section of the ventilation system had yielded this discovery. Something told him this wasn't something he should report through official channels, at least not yet. The following morning, Ray returned to the same area with an official inspection clipboard, hoping to examine the fabric more closely or perhaps find additional evidence. His stomach dropped when he rounded the corner and saw a fresh yellow caution tape across the doorway and a brand new padlock securing the entrance. Standing nearby was a security guard who hadn't been stationed there previously. "Area's off limits," the guard said flatly when Ray approached. "Asbestos remediation." "That wasn't on the schedule yesterday," Ray countered, keeping his voice casual while internally cursing himself for not collecting the fabric when he had the chance. "Emergency procedure," the guard replied with finality, turning away to indicate the conversation was over. That evening, Ray met Kyle in the parking lot of the Rusty Nail, checking over his shoulder before pulling out his phone. "This was stuck in the ventilator fan in the old East Wing," Ray explained, showing Kyle the photos. "Right near the area where they said your dad was last seen." Kyle's hand shook as he took the phone, zooming in on the images. The distinctive blue fabric was unmistakable, the same color, texture, and weight as the uniforms his father had worn daily for 20 years. "This is it," Kyle whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "This is Dad's uniform. I'm sure of it." The next day, Kyle showed the photos to Sarah and Amanda in their small apartment. Sarah's hands trembled as she examined the image, her fingers touching the screen as if trying to reach through it to touch the fabric itself. "It's the first real evidence in 7 years," she said, her voice barely audible. "Something tangible." Detective Burnett, now 6 months from retirement and increasingly obsessed with solving the case that had consumed his final years on the force, studied the photos carefully in his office. The discovery energized him, providing the concrete evidence he needed to request a new search warrant specifically targeting the ventilation system Ray had identified. "This is the breakthrough we've been waiting for," Burnett told the Mercer family as they gathered around his desk. "A judge can't ignore physical evidence like this." Chemtech's response was swift and predictable. Their legal team appeared in court the following day, arguing vehemently against the warrant. The area in question is currently undergoing renovation, the company's attorney stated. Access represents a significant safety hazard. Furthermore, all necessary documentation and authorizations would take weeks to process due to internal protocols. The judge, wary of corporate obstruction but bound by procedure, ordered a compromise, limited access for investigators, but only after proper safety protocols were established, effectively delaying the search by at least 2 weeks. Meanwhile, Ray Peterson found himself summoned to Human Resources, where a stern-faced manager informed him he was being terminated immediately for violation of safety protocols. "Your personal items will be collected from your locker and mailed to you," the manager said without making eye contact. "Security will escort you to the exit." The message couldn't have been clearer. Chemtech was closing ranks. News of the potential breakthrough in the Mercer case spread quickly through the community that had never forgotten Jim's mysterious disappearance. Former colleagues who had remained silent for years began reaching out to the family. One of them, Thomas Grayson, a former security guard, agreed to meet Burnett at a truck stop restaurant 30 miles outside Akron. "I can't say much," Grayson said nervously, constantly glancing toward the door. "Signed confidentiality agreements when I left. They'd sue me into oblivion." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "But I'll tell you this, look for Gregory Whitman. He was the security supervisor before Peters took over. Left the company a week after Jim disappeared. Heard he kept a journal." Locating Whitman proved challenging. The former security supervisor had moved multiple times over the years, deliberately staying off the grid. Burnett eventually tracked him to a small town in northern Michigan, living under his deceased brother's name in a weathered cabin at the end of a dirt road. Their initial meeting was tense. Whitman, now a sickly, prematurely aged man, denied any knowledge of the case. Only when Burnett mentioned the fabric discovery and the impending search warrant did Whitman's demeanor change. "They'll find something, won't they?" he asked, voice trembling. "After all these years?" "Depends," Burnett replied steadily. "What should we be finding, Mr. Whitman?" After a long silence, Whitman crossed to a cupboard and removed a loose floorboard. From the hidden space, he extracted a locked metal box. Inside was a leather-bound journal, meticulously maintained with dates, names, and details that made Burnett's blood run cold. "I was there that morning," Whitman confessed, his voice barely audible. "Jim wasn't supposed to be in the basement that day. That area was reserved for a special operation. That's what we called the illegal dumping. Since 2003, the company had been disposing of chemical waste directly into the drainage system that led to the Cuyahoga River." With Whitman's journal in hand, Burnett finally secured the comprehensive warrants needed for a full investigation. But when the forensic team arrived at Chemtech the following morning, they were met with chaos. An accidental fire had broken out overnight, precisely in the East Wing area they had planned to examine. Fire trucks surrounded Chemtech in the pre-dawn darkness, their emergency lights casting eerie red and blue patterns across the smoke-filled parking lot. Burnett watched grimly as firefighters directed powerful jets of water at the East Wing. Where flames had mysteriously erupted just hours before, investigators were scheduled to arrive. The timing couldn't have been more suspicious. "What are we looking at?" Burnett asked the fire chief, a heavy-set man with soot-streaked features. The chief shook his head grimly. "Multiple points of origin. We found accelerant traces near 3 separate doorways. This was no accident." Burnett's jaw tightened as he watched Chemtech executives huddled near a company SUV, their expressions carefully composed into masks of concern. The fire was a desperate move, but they had underestimated his determination. Later that morning, Burnett marched into Judge Harris's chambers, Whitman's journal clutched in his hand. The judge looked up from his desk, surprised by the detective's unscheduled appearance. "This isn't coincidence," Burnett said, placing the journal on the desk. "They're systematically destroying evidence of homicide and environmental crimes. I need a comprehensive warrant that covers the entire facility, not just the damaged section." Judge Harris leafed through the journal, his expression darkening with each page. The detailed account of corporate misconduct, culminating in Jim Mercer's death and the subsequent cover-up, painted a damning picture. After 20 minutes of careful reading, he looked up at Burnett. "You'll have your warrant within the hour, Detective. Full access, no restrictions." By noon, a forensic team in protective gear was combing through the fire-damaged East Wing. The blaze had been contained before destroying the entire section, and critical areas identified in Whitman's journal remained partially intact. Following the diagram sketched by the former security supervisor, investigators focused on a ventilation shaft that had once connected to an emergency shelter. "Detective Burnett," called one of the technicians, excitement evident in her voice despite the mask covering her face. "We've found something." Burnett hurried over to where the technician was carefully examining a section of wall revealed by the fire damage. What had appeared to be solid concrete contained a hidden compartment, now partially exposed. Inside, remarkably preserved, was a metal toolbox, Jim Mercer's toolbox, precisely where Whitman had described it being hidden. "Document everything," Burnett instructed, heart racing. "Every fingerprint, every fiber." When the toolbox was carefully opened, the contents brought a lump to Burnett's throat. Among the wrenches and screwdrivers lay Jim's Timex watch, still ticking, the time still accurate as if it had been waiting patiently for 7 years to be discovered. The back was inscribed, "To Jim, love Sarah, 2/14/98. With mounting evidence from the forensic team and Whitman's detailed testimony, Burnett assembled an ironclad case. Arrest warrants were issued for Robert Daniels, Howard Mitchell, and Carlos Ramirez, the 3 executives implicated in Jim's death and the subsequent cover-up. The news exploded across national media platforms. What had begun as a local missing person case in Akron morphed into a nationwide corporate scandal. Journalists descended on the small Ohio city, digging into Chemtech's history and uncovering decades of similar violations at facilities across the country. Chemtech's parent company scrambled to distance itself from the growing scandal. These were unauthorized actions by individual employees, not corporate policy, the CEO insisted during a hastily arranged press conference. His claims rang hollow when internal documents revealed that upper management had approved the illegal waste disposal practices to cut costs. The subsequent trial became one of the most closely watched in Ohio's recent history. Each day, protesters gathered outside the federal courthouse in Cleveland, many holding pictures of Jim with the phrase, "Justice for Jim Mercer," emblazoned across them. Sarah, Kyle, and Amanda attended every day of the proceedings, sitting in the front row, their faces a study in grief and determination. They listened as witness after witness detailed how Jim had accidentally discovered documents revealing the illegal dumping operation, how he had confronted the executives, and how his death, described as an accident during a heated confrontation, had been covered up for years. The most powerful moment came when Sarah took the stand to testify about the impact of Jim's disappearance. Wearing Jim's favorite jacket, she looked directly at the 3 defendants and spoke with unexpected clarity. "You didn't just steal a husband and father, you stole 7 years that we could have spent grieving at a grave instead of wondering if he'd come home someday. You stole Kyle's chance to show his father his high school diploma. You stole Amanda's chance to have her father walk her down the aisle someday. You stole birthdays, Christmases, everyday moments we'll never get back." Sarah paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "But you didn't steal our dignity or our determination. Jim was an honest man who gave his life trying to do the right thing. And we never, not for one moment, gave up on him." After 3 weeks of testimony and 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on all counts. Robert Daniels and Howard Mitchell were sentenced to 25 years each, while Carlos Ramirez, who had partially cooperated with prosecutors, received 18 years. Chemtech was fined $450 million, the largest corporate environmental fine in Ohio history, and forced to establish a compensation fund for victims of their pollution. The Mercer family received a substantial settlement, though Sarah insisted no amount could compensate for their loss. On the eve of the executive's sentencing, Sarah received an unexpected call. DNA analysis had confirmed that biological residue found where Jim was initially hidden belonged to him, and authorities believed they had identified the location where his remains were cremated, an abandoned industrial facility 2 hours from Akron. The abandoned industrial facility in West Virginia yielded no recoverable remains. The intense heat of the industrial furnace had left nothing to bury. For Sarah, this confirmation brought a strange mixture of finality and renewed grief. The small hope she had unconsciously harbored that Jim might somehow still be alive somewhere was finally extinguished, leaving her with the cold certainty of his fate. "At least we know now," she told Kyle and Amanda as they drove back to Akron. "We can give him a proper goodbye." The federal courthouse in Cleveland became the center of national attention as the trial of the 3 Chemtech executives commenced. Sarah, Kyle, and Amanda arrived together on the first day, walking past a gauntlet of reporters and cameras. Inside the imposing courtroom, they took their seats in the front row, directly across from the 3 men in expensive suits who had destroyed their lives 7 years earlier. The prosecuting attorney, Elena Martinez, delivered a powerful opening statement that captivated the packed courtroom. "This case is not just about the death of Jim Mercer," she declared, her voice resonant with conviction. "It is about corporate arrogance that views human lives as mere obstacles to profit." Gregory Whitman, visibly ill but determined to see justice done, took the stand early in the proceedings. His testimony provided the jury with a detailed account of that fateful morning and the subsequent cover-up that had spanned 7 years. Despite aggressive cross-examination from defense attorneys, Whitman's account remained consistent, his voice gaining strength as he finally unburdened himself of the truth he had carried for so long. When Sarah's turn came to testify about the impact of Jim's disappearance, the courtroom fell completely silent. Jurors leaned forward, many visibly moved as she described the limbo her family had endured. "We couldn't properly grieve because we didn't know," she explained, her composure remarkable despite the circumstances. Every phone call, every knock at the door, brought that moment of wondering if somehow it was Jim coming home. "For 7 years, we've lived in suspension between hope and despair." Kyle's testimony the following day revealed the practical consequences of his father's disappearance, his abandoned education, the financial struggles, the burden of becoming the family's provider at just 18 years old. "I had to become the man of the house overnight," he said, "but I never could fill my father's shoes." Amanda, now 23 and in her final year of college, spoke about growing up under the shadow of her father's disappearance. "I was 16 when my dad vanished," she said quietly. "He never saw me graduate high school or start college. Every milestone has been marked by his absence." After 2 weeks of testimony and evidence presentation, the case went to the jury. For 2 days, Sarah, Kyle, and Amanda waited, barely eating, hardly sleeping, as 12 strangers deliberated on the truth they had lived with for 7 years. When the jury filed back into the courtroom, Sarah clutched Kyle and Amanda's hands so tightly her knuckles turned white. The courtroom fell silent as the jury foreman rose. "On the count of involuntary manslaughter, we find the defendants guilty. On the count of obstruction of justice, we find the defendants guilty. On the count of criminal environmental violations, we find the defendants guilty." The litany of guilty verdicts continued, each one a small vindication for the family that had refused to give up. In the hallway afterward, the 3 Mercers embraced, their tears a mixture of relief, vindication, and renewed grief. When sentencing was announced the following week, justice was finally served. Robert Daniels and Howard Mitchell received 25 years each in federal prison, while Carlos Ramirez's partial cooperation earned him a reduced sentence of 18 years. In April of 2013, 5 months after the conclusion of the trial, the Mercer family finally held a funeral for Jim. Hundreds attended, former colleagues, neighbors, friends, and even strangers touched by the story of corporate malfeasance and a family's unwavering determination. The symbolic casket contained Jim's restored toolbox, his Timex watch, and a Cleveland Browns shirt he had loved wearing on Sundays. Frank Burnett, now officially retired but present at the ceremony, watched the family he had come to know in their most vulnerable moments. Sarah, still grieving but visibly lighter, as if an enormous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Kyle, who had recently enrolled in law school, inspired by the injustice his family had faced. And Amanda, who had started a support group for families of missing persons. After the funeral, Sarah used part of the settlement money to purchase a small house near Lake Erie. Not exactly the cabin Jim had dreamed of, but a place where the family could gather and remember. In the backyard, she planted an oak tree in Jim's memory. He was like this tree, she explained to Burnett during his visit. Strong, reliable, with deep roots. What happened to Jim was terrible, but it exposed that company and saved other families from going through the same suffering. On a sunny autumn Sunday, Sarah, Kyle, and Amanda sat on the deck of the lake house, watching the sunset over the water. Kyle held a fishing rod. He had learned the basics through online videos and books, trying to connect with the father he had lost when he was still a teenager. "I think he would be proud of us," Amanda said, breaking the contemplative silence. "For never giving up, for sticking together." Sarah smiled, watching her children, no longer children but adults forged by a tragedy that could have destroyed many families. "Your father always said that a person's character is revealed not when things are easy, but when we face the worst," she replied, touching the wedding ring she still wore. "Wherever he is, I know he's proud of the character you two have shown."